Welcome to Capitals Uncovered with Martin Sieff and Pelle Neroth Taylor and John Helmer, our regular guest, much esteemed, our expert on Russia and things Asian. And I'm talking to you from the UK. I arrived yesterday, and I was just saying before the show to my fellow panelists that it looks a bit shabbier. And of course, uh, Starmer's announced his resignation this morning. So the
Hooray!
UK's set for what is its eighth prime minister since Brexit or something, seventh or eighth or something like that. Since if you include Cameron, who left 10 years ago, I think that the
Yes.
Brexit vote was exactly 10 years ago. So it's been a time of chaos. And the people like Andrew Marr, who's a very well-regarded British journalist, says, "Oh, we're now going to go in for a time of long peace compared to the Europeans." I think he said that in 2024. The populists haven't risen in the UK, unlike those horrible what's happened in Europe. Well, Britain's been in a terrible chaos. British can't decide what to do, and one of the issues, I mean, people is migration, of course. The other is cost of living, and a large part of that cost of living is energy. Uh, the money being diverted to Ukraine. Now, Ukraine hardly came up, and that's what worries me because it's going to be something. The thing that bothers, I think, those of all three of us most is a possibility that this Ukraine war is going to escalate. And it's the Burnham who is the future prime minister. I mean, it's really undemocratic that this guy can just come in. He might be prime minister in as little as 10 days' time, and nobody voted for it. He's been kind of acclamated by the press, And who are these people? The press. What right do they have to make prime ministers and break prime ministers? Anyway, he hasn't said something about Ukraine. And just before Starmer went, the defense minister John Healey and his deputy Al something or other, can't remember, Al Carney, who's a former special forces soldier, they resigned, and they might be coming back in their old capacities. And it worries me what pressure the British deep state put on behind the scenes to make these things happen, and whether they prefer Burnham to Starmer because Burnham is more likely to escalate, or at the very least, borrow lots of money to increase defense spending. Which brings us to John. You wrote well. What's your take? Have you got any views, and what are the Russian views on the replacement of Starmer with Burnham? I heard that Burnham was very anti-Russian when he 10 years ago or something when it talks about
Yes.
bringing the World Cup to Russia. Do the Russians have an anxiety about Burnham? And then later on, you could just talk about your latest. Nabiulina, this central bank governor, she's back, and so we applied our Kremlinology a little bit, and perhaps you can help interpret that for us. But let's start off with what the Russian view of the new British political dispensation is.
Regrettably, the Russian view in the Kremlins is a fundamental mistake. And this reflects the factional politics which have been dominated in thinking about the Europeans and the British in relation to the future of the Ukraine war. Kirill Dmitriev, the so called special emissary for negotiations with the United States, has been beating the drum for the resignation of Starmer for every couple of hours in a tweet, and then every day for weeks. Dmitriev is very badly regarded, negatively regarded by all the senior officials I know, with the exception of the president. And very regrettably, Dmitriev has been spinning the line that a replacement of Starmer would be better for a negotiated outcome of the Ukraine on Russian terms. That's absolutely wrong. Burnham is as much a Russia hater as Starmer, though Starmer was, as an individual, probably less capable of hating as a politician like Burnham. Um, There'll be no regret to see the back of Starmer, but there's been no regret in military intelligence, in civilian intelligence, foreign ministry, general staff, and security council see the back of any of the British prime ministers. I don't believe we've ever had, in my time in Russia, that's now more than 30 years, a level of public dislike, distrust of the British. I mean, it's really unique, and that's been achieved by the likes of May, Johnson, Cameron, going back to Blair, in fact. So these, let's call them midget prime ministers, because they didn't last very long. And this one won't arguably last very long. He's there to try to win, to save Labor from being defeated at the next general election. And you may understand much better than I do, Pelle, what his prospects are, what the Labor Party's prospects are in the coming election. But there's a fundamental misapprehension on the part of Dmitriev and the faction he represents in thinking that the war in the Ukraine can be better solved by changes of regime. And it's not just Great Britain. Dmitriev and his group have told President Putin, and Putin repeats the line, that a significant change of regime in Great Britain, in Italy, in France, in Germany, in Finland, and in the European states would facilitate what I generally call the trust in Trump line, the TIT, the TIT line, which is a complete misapprehension. And over the last few hours, we've seen the foreign policy spokesman for President Putin, Yuri Ushakov, make the first statement he's ever made on behalf of the president to basically say the negotiation that were promised to Putin by Trump in the Anchorage summit last year, we've referred to that as the Anchorage formula. That's the US will guarantee Russian security in Europe for the foreseeable future. That's come to an end. And even Ushakov said, we will have to settle the conflict in the Ukraine by military means. He's now aligned the president, at least rhetorically, with the military intelligence assessment, the foreign ministry assessment, the SVR, the civil intelligence, and the general staff. So we're seeing change. As for escalation, well, of course, both sides are escalating. The Ukrainian escalation is largely a PR stunt, but it's a clever one. It's demonstrating the capacity to set fire to and make great pools of black smoke at refineries, relatively limited damage, but not insignificant damage in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, and so on. The problem that Russia now faces is that escalating on the Ukraine battlefield doesn't solve the problem, doesn't achieve the war aims. Pardon me if I've said it before, if we discussed this before, I don't mean to repeat. But the fact is that demilitarization of the Ukraine battlefield is no longer sufficient, or it's a necessary condition for the end of the war, but not sufficient, because remilitarization of Germany, represented by Merz, but Merz's successors will do the same and more. It's remilitarization of France, remilitarization of the UK, and Burnham will be as keen on that, if not more. You've just said it, Pelle, as the outgoing Starmer. So remilitarization of Europe means that demilitarization of the Ukraine battlefield won't be enough. Denazification, the other major war aim for Russia, of the Kiev regime isn't enough either. Why? Because the Germans have become Nazifying themselves. And Burnham will produce the same thing. And Meloni in Italy, and Macron in France. So denazification, partly the doctrine that Russia has to be fought to its destruction, partly a racial doctrine like Hitler's. Denazification is now European-wide. So Russia is now facing permanent war in Europe without the illusion that the Trump administration will, on the basis of whatever Trump said to Putin a year ago, will save the day. Permanent war is also what Iran's facing. And we're seeing right now uh, played out in slow motion, in the sense that the talks ongoing in Switzerland are a slow motion demonstration of US, Israeli, European attempts to mitigate the Hormuz Strait damage, but continue permanent war against Iran.
Mm.
On that score, I don't believe Burnham would be any improvement uh, compared to Starmer. But most important of all, you've just suffered, the British have just suffered the most extraordinary insult. Maybe Martin can remember one comparable, in which the President of the United States announced the resignation of the British Prime Minister before the British Prime Minister got up to announce it himself, and said basically, uh, so long, goodbye,
Yeah. What do you think,
good
Martin?
riddance. I mean, I've never seen, can you, Martin, remember a president of the United States ever saying about a British prime minister in public, good riddance? Now, I'm no defender of Starmer, obviously, but I have never seen a display of American imperial diktat to the British before, not
Mm.
like that.
Well, he
Uh,
certainly, yeah. Sorry,
no, go
Martin.
on.
No, I mean he did the same to Maloney, didn't he? He was supposed to be one of his close allies. But
Actually, Maloney showed she had more balls, to put it
yeah, that's
rather
right.
bluntly, than Starmer has.
Mm,
Maloney has actually done several things that Starmer's been incapable of doing.
mm,
From what I've read, and correct me if I'm wrong, the prob after to be speak vulgarly, after sucking up to Trump, as Maloney's been doing for months now, she actually was put in a position by Trump's behavior of having to defend the papacy, the Pope.
mm,
And from then on, I'm told, um, there was a problem with Trump. But there is a fundamental problem. The Italians are Catholic.
mm,
And we now have a race in the United States, presidential race, in which J.D. Vance is running as a Roman Catholic. And you won't find anything like the level of acrimony between Vance and Italy
mm,
that you now see between Trump and Maloney. But I
mm,
would say Maloney's uh, putting in a political performance that defends, I don't mean Italian dignity, I mean the national interest
mm,
of the country
mm,
in a way that Starmer was incapable of.
mm. Well, I just want to say well, two things. One is that um, some people on the right in the UK, the Daily Telegraph, said that Starmer was insufficiently pro-American, and I mean, I'm not placing any value on that, and
Yes.
that Andy Burnham will be forced to be more pro-American. Um, or align himself with the American security state or whatever. I haven't worked out the consequence of it because does that mean the permanent state, which is anti peace, or is it Trump and his at least temporary efforts to make peace, which means it could be a good thing if we for us who are peacemongers. The second thing is your Russian sources when they're talking about escalation. I know that Glenn Deason is always and the Stas Kaprivnik we had on the show, and other people with their ear to the ground in Moscow are saying that Europe might be struck any day now by a deterrent style attack by the Russians. Do you think that's imminent?
It's absolute rubbish.
Right.
And the only reason Deason says such things is that those who he is closest to on the Russia state propaganda platforms tell him to. And if
Right.
he said it was rubbish, he would cease to have their support. It's complete nonsense.
Right.
And there's no evidence at all. He can't find the evidence for it,
Right. Right.
neither Deason nor the others who
Right.
say that. I'm happy to
No, I think you're right,
argue.
and you've said that consistently, actually. And Deason's got 500,000 YouTube viewers, and I suppose you've got to keep them up with. That's the trouble when you're big. You have to be keep up the spinning top, as it were, with dramatic headlines, and
Yes.
because he's built himself
Especially
up
if
as the
you're
guy
broad.
warning of war. And then he knows Dmitry Polyansky, who's always feeding him that line, and I guess. ditto the Duran, although I think they're a little bit less alarmist. Anyway, well, we'll hold to you, John. I'm sort of tempted to think that you're right, not least because you're on our stable, as it were. But yeah,
Well, it's a pleasure being in your stable, but we don't eat the same hay. What we do, and we don't run the same races. And I'm more than happy to be challenged on the evidence. But look, how can the evidence that is being trumpeted possibly explain the fact that when the President Putin announced the Oreshnik attack on Belaya Tserkva as a demonstration effect, it wasn't even an attack on a Ukrainian target. He had President has not yet fired that particular weapon for a particular targeting purpose. The prospect of attacking a particular NATO state has been, as it were, signaled as a deterrent. Yes, the reason the Russian Defense Ministry published a list with a number and street address of drone manufacturing plants supplying drones to the Ukraine from Germany, from Denmark, from, if I'm not mistaken, from Great Britain and from Latvia. The reason is to signal a level of deterrence, another red line, which the Russian side has been prohibited from pursuing by the president. But if you suppose that that's a significant deterrent, how come the president refuses to allow the general staff to intercept and destroy the delivery nodes, the railroad line from Poland into the Ukraine through which those drones are delivered? There's been a profound reluctance on the part of the president to attack the obvious targets that are NATO targets inside Ukraine. So those who wish to say that, and it's really only a Russian PR advertisement, it's as empty an advertisement as Zelensky firing drones that are intended to produce maximum PR around Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's advertising a level of deterrence that's neither serious militarily nor serious politically.
I mean, there's a train crash in the UK about a few days ago. I don't know if you essentially a local, a national news story, not an international one. And I'm wondering, because the warmongers, the Atlantic Council, the Anne Applebaum types, the Economist, always warning that the Russians are all over Europe planning sabotage operations. They've been
Yes.
quiet on this one. Do the Russians carry out these under the radar gray zone attacks, or is that just Atlanticist propaganda? But they've been very quiet about this one, and I'm wondering whether this could be one of those operations.
The first answer is I don't know, nor is if it's below the radar, it's below mine too.
Right.
Uh, that you're right to surface these sorts of things and to notice that the United Kingdom, the Cabinet Office, the National Security Advisor, the Prime Minister, have been the very first to identify false attacks of polonium as a Russian conspiracy in 2006, Novichok as a Russian conspiracy to kill on the British mainland in 2018. There's no reluctance of the British state to exploit the opportunity to condemn President Putin for personally ordering attacks on British targets inside Britain. No reluctance at all. So I'm not aware that the British, neither MI5 nor the Metropolitan Police nor any other agency of the UK government has accused the Russian side of sabotage inside the country. I think I've seen some allegation that some chap was picked up planning to do something to the back fence of one or more of Keir Starmer's properties.
Yeah.
But it didn't match the level of sabotage theory of Russian covert operations, which the British people have accepted in the case of the polonium poisoning and then the Novichok case. I mean, the British public and all of the media, not just the mainstream ones, have all readily accepted the theory of Russian attack on British territory. And yet,
Yeah.
there's no evidence at all, and not
Right.
even fake evidence, not even bad evidence,
Yeah, yeah.
that there's a sabotage operation going on.
Martin, did you want to say something?
Not much to add, Pelle. Again, reflecting first of all, it's not just a pleasure, but a privilege to have you on, John, because you cut through the rhetoric, you cut through the myths that come from both the left and the right, and it's right now we need that more urgently than ever. But I fully accept your analysis on the political dynamics in and around the Kremlin. But something, as you know, I'm a Northern Irishman, and therefore by definition a neurotic worrier and gloom and doom man. And so my question is this. Clearly, as you've documented fully, President Putin has been a force for restraint, but also, as you have also documented, he is an isolated figure now in doing so. You have just pointed out that he is single-handedly restraining both the foreign ministry and the general staff. But can that change? Because Putin is also a very experienced leader, has been a president of Russia for 25 years, recognizes dynamics, makes change not lightly or hysterically or on the spur of a moment, the way, unfortunately, President Trump and other American recent leaders do. But may he be close to, or even now, as Ishakov's statement could be interpreted all too easily as saying, is he changing direction? Is he now tacking to the wind? And attacking from port to starboard instead? And you see what I'm saying here? Is his patience running out? And is the pressure on him to change direction indicating that? Because it seems to me from what you are saying that the consensus around the president, apart from our old friend Dmitriev, is towards a much more proactive line and escalation in Ukraine and against the NATO firebrands. So how much longer will Putin remain patient, or can he remain patient?
Clearly, you're right, Martin. There are these pressures. And President Putin's style is to always accommodate different factions. And in his method of thinking, and I followed it for all these years, he thinks you can balance between opposites. And he's one of those politicians who believes that you can say contradictory things out of different sides of your mouth. In the latest Ushakov statement, which aligns in its condemnation of the so-called trust in Trump Anchorage formula, it's quite possible Putin is accepting publicly the line that Trump has failed to deliver a credible guarantee for security in Europe. But he'll balance it. Let's watch. If he allows, as Ushakov said, I think roughly 3 days before this latest statement, that Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner will be welcome in the Kremlin, because Trump is being fed what Ushakov called, after the G7 meeting, harmful ideas. If they accept Witkoff and Kushner, as Ushakov has just said, then what Ushakov has said about the Anchorage formula is simply a case of saying one thing out of one side of Putin's mouth and another thing out of the other side. there can be no basis for having Witkoff and Kushner in Moscow, ever, ever. They're making a demonstration in Switzerland. They've made a demonstration in Gaza. They've made a demonstration in Iran that there is no term sheet, no MOU, no 14 points or 32 points or whatever the term sheet counts. They cannot be relied on to negotiate in either good faith or to deliver any security guarantee they make to the other side. Talking with them is a waste of breath. Regrettably, if we haven't seen yet a clear statement that Witkoff and Kushner are unwelcome in Russia because they've proved that nothing that comes out of their mouths can be believed to deliver anything approximating a Russian security concern. And if that is that's the meaning of the Anchorage formula, and if Ushakov represents Putin's rejection of the Anchorage formula, there can be no welcome mat again for Witkoff and Kushner. There can't be. But if you don't mind, I'd like to come back to the point I tried to make, because you gents have been Londoners for longer than I have. If Trump, as it were, said good riddance to the Prime Minister of Great Britain, is there anything left of the so-called special relationship? Can you conceivably maintain, can Burnham or anyone in British political life maintain that Britain provides any form of special relationship input other than it becoming a special vassal of the United States? That's what Trump has just done to Starmer. Is there anything left that could be called the special relationship? Do you think?
Well, Martin, you say, well, I'll just say what I think, that the British are probably, the British security state is probably saying that the next prime minister's got to cozy up to the Americans, however much they're getting political capital from distancing himself. That was one of the most popular things Starmer ever did, actually, to speak up to the Americans when he didn't join in the Iran stuff. Only 18% of Americans think of the US as an ally at the moment. I think that's quite a fickle opinion. I mean, it could change in a year. But the British are all over the place at the moment. They don't know who they are or where they're going. But on the other hand, I don't know whether this. So Starmer's probably, Burnham's probably got a lot of pressure to do, because the British realise that their military won't be ready for years, if ever. There'll be enormous pushback on borrowing and raising the defence. I mean, there's so many negative articles in the Telegraph about the realistic prospects of Britain getting an army and military in the next 5 or 10 years. I think they're way behind Germany. And so they realize that they still got to piggyback on the Americans, as they've always done, and supplying deception operations and trying to be the rider that steers the steed, as it were.
Exactly.
But I mean, is there any optimism there, in the sense that the Americans do seem to be more positive about? I mean, I just saw, maybe I'm going off on a tangent, but Tulsi Gabbard released all these COVID documentation yesterday or a couple of days ago, showing that the CIA had co-sponsored the Wuhan project. So the virus came out of a lab. Now, that would never come out of the British. It came out of the Americans. So I have this belief that the Americans are kind of. Well, I wrote a Substack article saying that in the Middle East in the 1950s, the British successfully managed to blame the Americans for their coups, basically, like in Iran in 1953. So because America gets the blame because it's a bigger target, and it's also more transparent. So the British are much more secretive. So the America takes the cop, especially in Europe, for doing stuff that's not actually theirs to blame. So if the British get closer to the Americans, does that mean that they're actually going to go along with what the Americans talk of peace? So in other words, getting closer to the Americans might actually be good for peace, is what I'm trying to say. I don't know what you think, Martin.
I think what you just said is the rational, sane, analysis, Pelle, and I don't think London, the London deep state is capable of it. Burnham, I think, just might be. I'm not optimistic about Burnham. I actually fully agree with John's assessment 100% on Burnham. So what I'm about to say is not meant to prettify Burnham. You and I know, Pelle, we've had one or two guests on from the Middle East who will, see no evil either in Iran or see no evil in Netanyahu, and will say, oh, they're really rational players all the time, and this, that, and the other. And of course, that simply isn't so. Even if they're rational players most of the time, they're still A, mean as shit, and B, you can reach situations where rational players run out of patience or do something very rash and stupid. Kaiser Wilhelm II did not want war in 1914. He had been a rational player. His best friend and closest advisor was the heir to the Austrian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So by killing the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, not only did the assassins eliminate the one force for restraint against Serbia and Russia in Austria-Hungary, they also eliminated the best influence for peace on the Kaiser. And the Kaiser was furious that rightly so, understandably so, that his friend had been foully, and his wife had both been foully murdered. So, and this led directly to catastrophism. Now, I don't see President Trump as having lost it yet. President Putin. But in President Trump's case, he keeps losing it or appearing to losing it, and then tries to climb back. But as John says, and we've also seen with Iran, Trump doesn't realize the damage has been done. There's yet another alarming point, I think you pointed out, John, that is seldom mentioned anymore. And that is, wherever you look at the crises of the world and Trump thinking he's trying to solve them, who does he send? Who does he rely upon? The same two hapless fellows, his son-in-law and Mr. Witkoff. And they're out of their depth. They're both superficial Wall Street investors. They don't even understand American industry. They have no background in history, no background in diplomacy, no background in the Middle East, no background in dealing with Russia or with China, no sense of strategy whatsoever, no understanding of how, as you have pointed out, John, to get lasting agreements in diplomacy, you have to work for a long time. You have to develop a record of trust, of enforcement, of fulfilling your promises and pledges, and of credibility. The president has not done that. He does not understand it. And Witkoff certainly does not understand it. And Jared Kushner, a million times over, does not understand it. They do not understand it, and they never will. They're incapable of doing it. And they don't have, none of them have around them any serious staff people from the military, from intelligence, from diplomacy, or from journalism, veteran people like yourself. If I had the chance, I would recommend that the White House flies you in to be a consultant to the NSC immediately, John, as a top priority. And there would be other people below you on the list. But have you been seriously interviewed by any British or American interlocutor? Please do tell us. Because I take the presumption of assuming, no, you have not. Is that correct?
Well, it is. You're quite correct, and I'm not speaking from modesty here.
No, but you don't have
there's
to.
a fundamental difference that you can't advise the empire to behave in an anti-imperialist fashion
exactly
when it thinks, and it's not quite wrong or mistaken to think that it's getting stronger. And,
yes,
I think we have to look at our colleagues in the podcast universe, and we have to look at the situation. And we can say there are those of our colleagues, not necessarily our friends, who think that Russia has won its war and Iran has won its war. There are those who say, no, pardon me, the US has won its war in Iran and its war in Europe, and that the Europeans and the Ukrainians are gradually winning their war against Russia. Both of these things, these lines, propaganda lines for the US empire, and which arguably is getting stronger in several key ways, but losing tactically in some places. I think what space misses or misunderstands is that you can be right to say Iran and Russia have won their wars, and you can be right at the same time who say the US is stronger. Tactically, Iran has won significantly on the battlefield that was forced on it by Israel and the United States. But strategically, Iran faces permanent war. It doesn't produce the really profitable clicks in the podcast universe, and it runs counter to the mainstream media. It's not propaganda, and propaganda pays.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we don't get paid for seeing things differently. What if I just put it to you this way, as a general thought? We can come back to this over and over. And you were talking, Martin, about World War I. Let me go back another almost 100 years to von Clausewitz, the Prussian, who's most famous for saying war is the continuation or extension of politics by other means. I'd like to say that when one is in an imperial time as we are now, Clausewitz has to be reversed. It's politics. Politics is the extension of war by other means. War is now an end in itself. And Trump represents, and I'm not saying conferring any benefit or endorsement of it, Trump represents the ideal spokesman for genocide, violence, force as a coercive policy in itself. And he's making it pay for the United States, but first of all for himself, for his family, for his associates, and so on. So if we see the two big wars that are currently being waged, and we agree, as we were saying before, that Russia is now facing permanent war with NATO, permanent war. It may and is winning tactically on the battlefield, but the battlefield victory isn't the war, isn't the end of war. And those in the propaganda departments of the podcast universe and those in the propaganda departments of the states which pay for them are simply misleading. They're trying to exaggerate tactical victory and ignore permanent war. The same with Iran. Iran has its factional politics. They're very interesting. I'm only beginning to learn. I'm a freshman at that, a novice. I don't pretend to talk about it. I can simply see it being played out. At the same time, I have to say that they are not, even the Iranian factions do not articulate that even if they achieve their war aims, their defensive war aims, their recovery aims in Switzerland and in the ongoing 60-day negotiation or the permanent negotiation which will follow, they are facing permanent US war against them. It'll go from the Persian Gulf to the Pakistan front. They're going to face a US-inspired, US-directed Pakistan platform against Iran in Iran's east, Pakistan's west. They're already seeing the US and Israel and others mobilizing on the northern front, which for Iran means Azerbaijan and Armenia. And there will be an attempt also by the United States to cut off Iran's Caspian Sea front and the link between Iran and Russia through the Caspian Sea, which is increasingly important if Iran faces blockades in the south. Now, that's permanent war, and Iran's got to be prepared for it. and do the best it can at this stage. And that's a factional argument that one has if you're Iranian. You argue how best to handle a negotiation right now to achieve a 60-day ceasefire, to achieve some recovery of assets and cash against the US that's produced a 14-point plan, 14-point MOU, which is already in violation on the ground in Lebanon. But Vance's briefing, Vice President Vance's briefing last Monday, showed he has no intention of complying with several of the other points, starting with the sanctions, the release of sanctioned assets. So I think what we're in is, for us as observers and analysts, a very interesting but very lonely place, because we aren't propagandists, and we can see with great misgiving and disappointment those of our colleagues who fall for that line. We can see our audience wants desperately to have some hope. The younger you are out there, the more you need to feel that when you wake up, the world looks more hopeful than it is. If you're British, and I feel strongly that I've grown up with and still have a great British culture, which happens in my book to mean anti-imperial, anti-colonial.
Yes.
The English Civil War is a history I cherish for the rise of the village Hamdens, those ordinary people who did exceptional things out of their mouths, out of their heads, with their arms and legs and weapons during the Civil War, and then were cruelly repressed, first by Cromwell and then by the monarchy that came back. So British culture means that for me, and I cherish it and want it to continue to. So I've raised this point of how can the British, those who I'm most close to, the Cornish and that part of London which I love, tolerate the kind of insult to the culture that has been inflicted by Trump on the British in the last few days. This is extraordinary. And when you see the Iranians fight back against that, that's racial. And the Iranians are fighting back. The Russians are fighting back. And this is an imperial fight, which mostly we're going to lose.
Well, I don't think we've got time to talk about it this time. We could talk about it next time, along with the assassination attempt against you. So we'll hold that in reserve for in the next show. But because just to sum up, and I'll end on this, is that a lot of people think that this was, even in the mainstream media, will say this is a big loss for the American empire, and that sort of feeds into this idea that the West is in decline and China is on the ineluctable rise, and it's a Thucydides trap. America will strike out before. But it's basically striking from a point of weakness, and you're slightly heterodox position. You're saying that no, America is growing stronger, or at least it thinks it's growing stronger. So
yeah,
is that there's a difference there, and in fact, maybe I didn't make the difference there, which is dangerous because if you're unrealistic about where you're going, that's when bad things can happen for everyone.
Except that genocide kills. Genocide works, and it's not just thinking that violence is an end in itself. Julius Caesar taught the Gauls, as well as the Britons, that violence can be an end in itself, that it succeeds. The Romans totally suppressed Gaelic culture until it was forgotten. We can bring it back now. By archaeology and brilliant historical research. But genocide works, violence works, and empires preserve themselves by imposing the fear of that violence, making examples of the genocidal targets so that everyone else is terrified. And in that sense, the US empire is not falling down. It's not making a mistake about its interests. And frankly, it's another program. The Chinese response to this is dismal. absolutely bloody dismal. Just to remind that the four principles of Xi Jinping are, and I keep them handy just to look at them. The four principles of Xi Jinping thought is peaceful coexistence, national sovereignty, international rule of law, and coordination of development and security. Now, those are not original for the Chinese, including podcasters who specialize in offering us Chinese expertise on everything. These are unoriginal ideas that are fatuous in a world of imperial violence, fatuous and empty. And for the Chinese to argue that their empire is going to win eventually because they're so bloody good at their technology, their AI, their economic power, is simply a form of imperial delusion on the way down, not the way up.
John, I think we'll end there. Absolutely fascinating. And we'll see you, I guess, in 2 weeks. Martin, thank you so much, both of you. I just wish you a very good day. Thank you so much.